I will tell you exactly how a man can be given the best thing of his life and spend the better part of a year trying to prove to himself it is only adequate. That was me, Cal Dunmore, Broken Horn Valley, Wyoming Territory, autumn of 1881. A cattle operation going thin at the edges from 4 years of being run by a man whose attention was split between the herd and a grief he wouldn't look at directly. 60 head down from the previous season, the south fence losing the argument with the frost. The ranch house holding together mostly out of stubbornness, mine and the buildings both. I was 48 years old. My wife Elsa had been gone since the spring of '77. I did not talk about it. I kept the ranch, I kept the herd, I kept myself upright and functional, and I told myself that was sufficient for a man my age. It was not a life that needed a woman in it. It was a life that needed organization. That is what I told myself when I wrote to the letter broker in Laramie. His name was Prewitt, and he ran a respectable operation, matching ranchers and homesteaders with women willing to relocate for a practical arrangement. I was careful with the letter. I set down what I required, a capable woman accustomed to hard work, who understood that what I was offering was a clean home, provisions, fair treatment, and the legal protection of a married name. I was not offering poetry. I was not offering soft conversation by the fire. I was offering a working arrangement between two adults who understood the frontier and had no illusions about it. Prewitt wrote back that he had a woman who might suit. Nora Vane, widowed 4 years prior from a farm outside Knoxville, Tennessee, 34 years old. No children. She had written to him, he said, with what he called unusual directness. She had listed what she was willing to provide and what she was not, and she had specified that she was not looking for charity or sentiment, only for a fair arrangement with a man who ran an honest operation. I read that letter twice, then I wrote back and said send her the terms. She wrote to me once before she came. A single page, the handwriting precise and unhurried. She said she had read my terms and found them reasonable. She said she was a fair cook and a capable hand with livestock, that she had managed her late husband's farm for the last 18 months of his illness nearly alone, and that she did not expect Broken Horn Valley to resemble Tennessee. She said she would arrive on the 14th of October. She did not say she was nervous or hopeful or sad. She did not ask me anything personal. She stated what she intended and left room for me to do the same. I respected that more than I wanted to admit. She arrived on the 14th, as promised. I drove the wagon up to the depot at Garner's Crossing, the nearest town with a rail stop, 14 miles north of the ranch, and I waited on the platform with my hat in my hands and the particular discomfort of a man who has arranged something he is not entirely sure he can explain. The train was 20 minutes late. I stood in the October wind and watched the mountains to the west go dark purple with the cold coming off them, and I thought about Elsa, which I did not usually allow myself to do in public places. I thought about the first time I'd picked her up from that same platform, 22 years earlier, when she'd come out from Ohio as a girl of 26 with a single trunk and enough opinions to stock a general store. How she'd shaken my hand like a business partner and told me she'd need at least one decent lamp for the bedroom, or there would be no reading done, and then she'd be useless to both of us by February. I shut that down. This was not that. This was a different thing, a practical thing, and I needed to remain clear about the difference. The train came. People got off. I watched the steps. Nora Vane was the third person down. She was not what I expected, which is a fool's admission since I had not told myself I was expecting anything in particular. She was medium height, dressed in a dark gray traveling dress that had seen some hard use but was clean and well-mended. Brown hair tucked under a sensible hat. A face that was, I would have said, plain at first if I had been asked. Composed. Not smiling, not frowning. She looked around the platform with the eyes of a person taking inventory. Those eyes landed on me. She walked over without hesitation. "Mr. Dunmore," she said, not a question. "Miss Vane, Mrs. Vane." "Nora is fine," she said. She looked at the wagon. "Is that everything?" I blinked. "It's the wagon I drove up in." "I meant, is there anything else you needed to do in town before we go? I have 2 trunks and a satchel. I can help load if you'll show me where." We loaded her trunks. She was capable with the weight of them without making a show of it. We drove south through the afternoon, the mountains coming up on the left and the range spreading out to the right, gold and brown with the October grass. She looked at it without comment for the first mile. Then she said, "How many head?" 63 this season, down from 82. What took them? Hard winter 2 years back, lost 8 to cold. Sold some I shouldn't have when the price was up, and then it kept going up. She nodded as if I'd confirmed something she'd already suspected. What's the south fence situation? I looked at her. I mentioned the fence in my letter. You said the south pasture boundary was in need of attention before the hard season. I took that to mean the fence was losing. What kind of posts? Cedar, some of them going soft at the base. They'll need pulling and resetting before the ground freezes, she said. I can help with that. I did not say anything for a moment. You've done fence work, I said finally. My husband was ill for the last year and a half. The farm had to run somehow. She said it without self-pity, just a plain fact. I absorbed it and we drove on, and by the time we came down into Broken Horn Valley in the early dusk, the ranch house sitting back against the cottonwood line, smoke coming from the chimney where I'd left the stove banked. I was already slightly off balance in a way I couldn't fully account for. The first 3 weeks, she was simply capable. That is the word I kept settling on. Not impressive, not noteworthy, just capable the way a well-made tool is capable. It does what it is meant to do and does not make a fuss about doing it. She cooked without extravagance, solid, plain, frontier food, hearty enough for a working ranch. She learned where things were and put them back where they belonged. She took stock of the root cellar and told me we would need more flour and salt pork before the first hard snow, and she was right. She helped pull and reset 11 fence posts along the south pasture line. She did not require instruction on how to handle the work. She watched me set the first 2, and then she set the next one herself and asked only, right depth. It was right. I had hired a hand named Tori, a young man from New Mexico, 22, who had been with me 2 seasons and was decent with cattle though useless as a conversationalist. He watched Nora that first week with visible uncertainty, not sure how to fit her into the ranch's order. By the second week he had decided she was simply another competent presence and treated her accordingly. She and I established an economy between us. She ran the house. I ran the cattle and the land. When the 2 overlapped, hauling wood, setting fence, the occasional shared work, we did it side by side and without much talk. She did not push at me. She did not try to make the house something warmer than I had established it as being. She set a vase on the kitchen table one afternoon, just a jar of dried grass and a few late mountain asters she'd gathered off the hillside, and I noticed it and said nothing, and neither did she, and it stayed there. That was the arrangement. It was, I told myself, exactly what I had asked for. The first thing that got under my guard was not a grand gesture. It was a calf. 3rd week of October. A heifer I'd been watching dropped early, the calf coming wrong, and I was in the barn at 2 in the morning with my arm in a place no man enjoys having his arm, and the heifer was terrified and the calf was stuck, and Tori was asleep in the bunkhouse. I was losing ground. The barn door opened and Nora came in. She was dressed, coat over her nightclothes, lantern in hand. She took one look and set the lantern down on a post and came to the other side of the heifer without a word. I've done this before, she said. Tell me what you need. What I needed was a second pair of hands and calm, and she had both. She kept the heifer steady while I worked, talking to the animal low and even, and 20 minutes later we had a live calf on the barn floor and a heifer who was going to be fine. I sat back on my heels in the hay, breathing hard and thoroughly unsanitary, and Nora crouched down and looked at the calf with an expression I can only describe as satisfied. Boy, she said. Yeah. You want to name him? I don't name cattle. I know, she said. I'm asking anyway. I looked at her across the calf. There was hay in her hair and she didn't know it or didn't mind. Her face in the lantern light was more than plain. It was real, fully present, and unsentimental in a way I found I was not prepared for. Call him whatever you want, I said. She considered. I'll call him Prewitt, she said. Seems appropriate. I almost laughed. I did not, but I came closer than I had in some while. She went back to the house. I stayed in the barn until the calf was nursing and the heifer was calm. When I walked back across the yard in the dark, there was lamplight still in the kitchen window. She'd put coffee on. She was back in bed by the time I came in. She would not have made a thing of it, but the coffee was there, and it was hot, and I stood in the kitchen in the cold dark and drank it and told myself this was no different than having a capable hired hand who anticipated practical needs. I nearly believed it. November came in hard that year. The temperature dropped 40 degrees in 4 days, and the snow followed, not the early dusting but the real thing. A 2-day blow that buried the fence line and took out the top third of the cottonwood nearest the house with a sound like a rifle shot at 3 in the morning. I was out of bed and down the stairs before I was fully awake, and Nora was already at the bottom of the stairs, holding a lamp. "Tree," she said. "I know, go back to bed. It might have hit the woodshed. I'll check. I'm coming." I did not argue. We went out together in the lantern light, and the driving snow and the woodshed was fine, just the tree down across the corner of the yard. We stood there in the cold for a moment looking at it, the snow coming sideways and the lamp guttering, and I was aware of her shoulder against my arm, both of us looking at the same thing, and I moved away and said the tree would wait until morning. We went back inside. She put more wood on the stove, and we stood near it while the feeling came back into our hands. She made no comment on any of it. She went back upstairs after a time, and I sat in the kitchen until the stove was drawing properly, and then I sat there a little longer than I needed to. That was the beginning of the winter. By December, I knew the shape of her days the way I knew the shape of the ranch, not from study, but from simple proximity over weeks. I knew she woke before me and was quiet about it. I knew she took her coffee black and did not want to talk much until she'd had it. I knew she read in the evenings. She'd brought 4 books in one of those trunks, and she'd already finished 2 of them and started a third. I knew she had strong opinions about whether the root cellar door was latching correctly, and almost no opinions at all about whether the kitchen curtains matched anything. I knew she could go the better part of a day on the range without complaint, and that she did not pretend fatigue she didn't have. I knew, and this one I turned away from regularly, that when she looked at something she was thinking about, really thinking, her expression had a quality of interior distance that I found I could watch for longer than was strictly accounted for by any practical need. I did not examine any of this too closely. I kept the wall up. I told myself the arrangement was working well, which it was, and that I was functioning at a higher capacity than I had in 4 years, which was also true, and that both of these things were attributable to the restored order of the household and nothing more complicated than that. Tori, for his part, observed me with the benign uncomprehension of a young man who does not yet know what it looks like when an older man is lying to himself, and so he was no help whatsoever. The thing about a marriage of convenience is that it has a sound to it. It sounds like 2 people eating at the same table. It sounds like footsteps on the stairs and the particular creak of a door you have heard for years, now complicated by not being yours. It sounds like a voice in the morning saying, without particular warmth but without coldness either, "The pump is freezing again. Do you have a spare piece of pipe?" It sounds like supper being on the table when you come in from the cold, not because she is required to provide it, but because she has and you have not discussed it, and the arrangement has settled into itself. What it also sounds like, and I was slow to hear this, is a person's particular laugh. Nora did not laugh often. She was not a grave woman. She had a dry sense of humor that surfaced occasionally in a single flat observation that you either caught or you missed, and if you missed it, she did not explain it. But she laughed, sometimes when she was reading, a short exhale of genuine amusement she seemed not to know she'd made. Sometimes when the calico cat that had adopted the barn tried to come into the kitchen, and she intercepted it, and the 2 of them had a brief negotiation. Once in December, when Tori attempted to explain to her that he had a system for storing the harness that was superior to the method the previous hand had used, and she listened to him with perfect seriousness through the entire explanation, and then said, "That's exactly how my late husband stored harness, and his operation was no different." And Tori blinked, and said he supposed he'd heard that somewhere, and she let it go with a very small sound that was half laugh and half something else. I heard that sound, and I held on to it longer than I had any business doing. January was bad. 3 weeks of cold that drove the cattle into the south shelter and kept us close to the buildings. The range was dangerous, footing gone, wind brutal off the north ridge, and I cut back on how far I rode, which meant the work concentrated around the barn and the yards. We were in each other's company more than either of us had planned for in an arrangement designed around 2 people with separate spheres. It was not uncomfortable. That is what surprised me. It was easy in a way I had not experienced in a long time, the ease of 2 people whose rhythms have settled into the same house and stopped negotiating. She did not talk to fill silence. I did not talk to fill silence. When one of us did talk, it meant something was worth saying and the other one listened. We talked about the ranch mostly. The cattle, the fence, the spring plans I was thinking through for expanding the south pasture if the market held. She had observations, practical, grounded in having run a working operation herself, and I found I wanted to hear them. Not because I needed them, not always, but because she saw things at angles I didn't always approach from, and it was useful. We talked once about Tennessee. She described the farm, the lay of the land, the way the hills held the morning fog, the creek that ran behind the house. She did not speak of her late husband much. When she did, it was brief and factual, and she did not invite questions, so I asked none. I told her about Broken Horn Valley in the early years, before I had the cattle, just the land and a one-room structure that called itself a house, and about 6 months of learning that Wyoming in February had opinions. She listened the way she always listened, fully, without performing attention. I told her about Elsa once, only a little, the way she'd come out and shaken my hand on the platform and demanded a decent lamp. Nora listened, and then she said, "She sounds like she had good sense about what mattered." That was all she said. She did not push into the grief. She just acknowledged that it was real, and then she left it alone, and that was, I didn't know what that was. It was more careful with me than most people managed. I took that into the cold night, and I examined it there, and I told myself, it was simply the respectfulness of a woman who had made her own losses, and understood that other people's were not hers to occupy. That was true. It was also not the whole of it. February 3rd. I will know that date the rest of my life. We'd had a 3-day warm spell, unusual for February, the temperature up into the 30s, enough to make the packed snow slick at the surface. I'd gone out in the afternoon to check the south pasture gate, which had been stiff, and Nora had gone to the smokehouse to inventory what we had left of the winter's pork. The smokehouse sat behind the barn, 12 yards from the back door, on ground that sloped slightly toward the creek. I was at the gate when I heard it. Not a scream, she was not the sort of woman who screamed. A sharp sound and then nothing. I was across the yard before I had made any decision about it. I came around the barn and found her on the ground at the base of the slope on her side, one hand on the ice she'd gone down on. She was already pushing herself up. "I'm fine," she said immediately. "Don't move. Cal, stay still a moment." I crouched beside her. She had gone down hard. I could see it in the way she was holding her left arm, not dramatically, just slightly guarded. I looked at her face. She was pale the way a person goes pale when pain has cut through their composure, but she was steady and her eyes were clear. "Can you move the arm?" She moved it carefully, winced once. "It's the shoulder, I fell on it." "I don't think it's broken. We'll get you inside." "I can walk." "I know you can walk," I said. "We're going inside." I helped her up, she let me, which told me more than her words about how much it hurt. And we went in through the back, and I settled her in the kitchen chair, and I looked at the shoulder, pressing carefully, and she was right. It was not broken, badly bruised and possibly a mild strain. I had her move it through the range of motion and watched her face and determined she was not hiding anything serious. I fixed the shoulder as well as I could, wrapped it, told her to keep it still, went and put water on for coffee and stood with my back to her at the stove. I do not know how long I stood there, long enough that she said quietly, "Cal." I turned. "I'm all right," she said. She was watching me with those clear, steady eyes. "I went down on a slick patch, it happens." "I know it does." "You don't need to look like that." "Like what?" She considered me for a moment. "Like you're deciding something," she said. I poured the coffee. I put a cup in front of her and I sat down across the table, and I looked at the jar of dried grass and late asters that had been there since October. She'd added to it twice, quietly, without comment, and I did not say anything for a while. Then I said, "What was your husband's name?" A small pause. "Thomas." "Did he know what he had?" She looked at me. "What do you mean?" "He had you running that farm alone for a year and a half while he was sick. Working the land, managing the livestock, keeping the operation alive by yourself while you also watched him go. Did he know what he had?" She was quiet a moment. "He tried to," she said finally. "He wasn't always good at saying it." I nodded. We drank our coffee. She did not ask me what that question was about. She already knew, I think. She simply waited, as she had been waiting all winter, quietly and without pressure, for me to catch up to what she had apparently understood for some time. I had not been slow because I was broken. I want to be clear about that for anyone who hears this. I had not been slow because Elsa's loss had made me incapable. I had been slow because I had told myself the whole arrangement was one thing when it was very clearly becoming another. And I had kept telling myself that because the other thing was frightening in the way that real things are frightening. You can manage a practical arrangement. You cannot always manage what happens when the practical arrangement turns out to contain something actual. I sat with her in the kitchen that afternoon while the shoulder rested and the stove put out its heat, and the light went thin and cold through the window, and I let myself know what I knew. It did not happen in a rush. That was not how either of us was built. The next morning she was up early as usual, the shoulder still guarded but functional, and I came down to find her cutting biscuits with her right hand and compensating carefully with the left when she needed it. I told her to sit down and I made the biscuits. She sat and watched me with an expression that was not quite amusement and not quite something else, and she said, "You can cook." I lived alone for 4 years. Most men who live alone eat badly. I eat badly, I said. These biscuits are going to be terrible. They were not terrible. She ate 2 without comment, which I took as a review. The shoulder healed over the following week. We moved back into our established rhythm, but it had shifted, not much, not dramatically, just enough that we both knew it. I stopped working so hard to maintain the distance. She, for her part, had never been working at it at all. She had simply been present, waiting for the room to exist. We started talking more in the evenings. Not about the ranch, or not only about the ranch. About things she'd read and what she thought of them. About the country she'd come from and whether she missed it. About what she had expected when she'd written to Prewitt's office and whether the Wyoming territory had met or exceeded the terms she'd been promised. "The cold is worse than I expected," she said one evening. "The rest is better." "What rest?" She looked at the fire. "The land," she said, "and the work. I was worried I'd be confined to the house." "I am not confined to the house." "You never seem to be waiting for permission." "No," she agreed, "but some men would have made it difficult." I looked at her. "I would not have." "I know," she said, "that was in the letter." I thought about that letter I'd written, the plain terms, the absence of poetry, the honest statement of what I was and was not offering. "I didn't offer much," I said. "You offered what was true," she said. "That's more than most." We sat by the fire. The ranch was quiet around us, Tory in the bunkhouse, the cattle sheltered and accounted for, the mountain wind going around the corners of the house the way it always did in February. The lamp put out its light. The fire put out its heat. She was reading. I was mending a piece of harness, or I had been, but I had stopped a while ago and was simply sitting. "Nora," I said. She looked up. I had several things I could have said. I had been holding them at arm's length for weeks, and I knew what they were. I am not a man who uses many words for the things that matter most. Elsa used to say I communicated best with action, and she wasn't wrong, but there are some things that require words, and I knew this was one of them. "This isn't how I intended it when I wrote that letter," I said. She was watching me steadily. "I know," she said. "What I mean is, it's more than I set out to arrange." "Yes," she said, "it is." "I'm not sure I'm good at this," I said. "The other part. The part that's not the arrangement." She considered me with that clear-eyed steadiness that had disarmed me since October. "You've been very good at it," she said. "You just weren't calling it by the right name." I sat with that a moment. "The coffee," I said, "the morning after the calf." "That was just coffee," she said, but there was something in her voice. "The biscuits." "You made the biscuits because my shoulder hurt." "Yes," I said, "and—" She looked at the fire. "And I would have made them for you," she said quietly, "if the positions were reversed without being asked." There it was. I set the harness down. I moved to the chair beside her, not dramatically, just the 4 feet across the hearth, and I sat near her and I said, "I don't know how to start this over from a better beginning." "You don't have to start it over," she said. "It already started, you just weren't watching." "I was watching," I said. "I was watching the whole time. I was just telling myself something different about what I was seeing." She smiled then, not the small contained expression I'd grown used to. but something fuller and warmer that changed her face considerably. It was the first time I had seen her smile that way, and I understand now that I had been waiting for it without knowing I was waiting. "Well," she said, "now you're telling yourself something accurate." The spring came the way springs come in Broken Horn Valley, not gently but gratefully, the snow retreating up the mountain faces and the creek running cold and clear, and the first grass coming up in the south pasture with the particular green of things that have survived something hard. We were married, properly married, before a circuit preacher who came through Garner's Crossing in April in the kitchen of the ranch house, with Tori as the witness and the calico barn cat observing uninvited from the doorway, which Nora chose to regard as a good omen. It was a short ceremony. The preacher asked the necessary questions, we gave the necessary answers, and that was that. Afterwards, Tori shook my hand with the solemnity of a young man who has watched something happen that he does not fully understand, but recognizes as significant. Nora shook the preacher's hand and thanked him for the detour. He said he had performed a good many such ceremonies, and this was among the more composed, and she said she would take that as a compliment. After the preacher left, we stood in the kitchen. The jar on the table had been refilled with early wildflowers, blue ones from the creek bank, which she'd gathered that morning, and I had watched her go out for them from the window and had not said anything because there was nothing to say that the jar itself didn't already cover. "Well," Nora said. She looked around the kitchen with the satisfaction of a woman who has assessed an inventory and found it properly accounted for. "That's done." "That's done," I agreed. She went to start supper. I stood in the kitchen a moment longer, looking at the jar of flowers on the table, and the stove she'd already learned to manage in its particular moods, and the window that had been dark with January cold, when I finally understood what had been plain to her from the beginning. I had written to Prewitt for order, for a capable woman who would restore the household to function and ask nothing of me that I was not prepared to offer. I had set the terms very carefully, and I had meant every one of them, and they had been met exactly. And then the winter had done what a Broken Horn Valley winter always does. It had stripped everything down to what was real. That June she found the letter. I had not hidden it. I'm not a hiding things sort of man. It was in the desk in the front room, the first letter I'd sent to Prewitt, and she came across it while she was looking for a piece of paper to write out our supply list, and she brought it to the kitchen table and set it down and looked at me over her coffee. "This is the letter," she said. "Yes." She read it again right there. I let her. I knew what it said, the terms, the plain statement of requirements, the deliberate absence of anything warmer. I did not attempt to contextualize it. She put it down, she looked at me. "Capable woman," she read back. "Accustomed to hard work, understands what's being offered and has no illusions." "Yes, that was the whole of it. That was what I thought I needed," I said. "And now..." I looked at her across the table. The June light was coming through the window, and she had a smear of flour on her sleeve from the bread she'd been making when she found the letter, and the barn cat, who had completely defeated our attempts to exclude him from the house, was asleep on the chair in the corner. Outside the window, the south pasture was green, the fence straight, the cattle moving slow and fat in the June morning. The operation was running well, better than it had in years. "Now," I said, "I think what I thought I needed was a reasonable cover story for being too scared to say what I actually needed." She was quiet for a moment, then she said which was. "You know what it was." "I know what I think it was," she said. "I want to hear you say it." I looked at her. At the woman who had come with 2 trunks and a satchel and a single-page letter of practical terms, and had set a jar of dried grass on my kitchen table within the first 2 weeks and never once asked me to be more than I was, and had simply been more herself, more present, more real, more worth knowing, than I had been prepared for. "I needed someone to make this place something again," I said. "Not just run it, make it something. I'd been keeping it going for 4 years, and I'd forgotten the difference between those 2 things." "And," she said. And I said, "I needed it to be you." She looked at me for a moment. Then she folded the letter twice, very precisely, and she set it on the table between us. "I knew that," she said, "by the end of October." "I know you did. You took your time." "I did. You could have saved us both a January," she said, but there was no edge in it. Just the dry precision of a woman who had made her own calculations and had been willing to wait them out. I could have, I agreed. I'm sorry for the January. The January was fine, she said. She picked up her coffee. The January was when I understood how the ranch worked. She stood and went back to her bread. I sat with my coffee and the letter between us on the table, and after a moment I folded it once more and put it in my shirt pocket, which is where it still is. I have been asked, once or twice over the years, how the arrangement began. People who knew I had written to Prewitt, who knew the terms I'd set, a capable woman, practical, no illusions, sometimes asked how it had turned from that into what it clearly was. I told them the truth. I said, I arranged what I thought I needed, and what arrived was what I actually needed, and there is a man-sized gap between those two things that took me the better part of a winter to cross. Torrey left us the following year to start his own place down in New Mexico, and on his last night at the ranch, he said to me, with the confidence of a young man who has been watching something longer than he's let on, Mr. Dunmore, I figured it out around December, that you were in trouble. I said, December seems about right. He said, Mrs. Dunmore figured it out before Thanksgiving. I said, I am not surprised. He laughed and shook my hand, and that was the last we saw of him for several years, until he came back through Garner's Crossing on his way north and stopped to tell us he'd taken a wife himself, and would we come to the wedding. We would, and we did. The operation grew. Slow, steady, the way things grow in Broken Horn Valley when they are properly tended. By 1883, we were back above 80 head. By 1885, we were north of 100, with 2 hands instead of 1, and the south pasture we'd talked about expanding in that January of careful conversation had been expanded, the fence straight and solid, not a soft post in it. We built a proper parlor onto the east side of the house the spring after Torrey left, not because we needed it, but because Nora had mentioned once, without complaint, that it might be useful to have a room that was not also a kitchen when there was mending to be done and reading to be done at the same time. I had thought about that for 3 weeks, and then I bought the lumber. She did not say anything when I started framing it out. She came to the doorway of what would be the parlor and looked at the work and said, You're putting the window on the south wall. Better light, I said. Yes, she said, that's right, and she went back inside. That was Nora, that was how we were. The right words when they were needed, and a comfortable absence of words when they weren't. I am telling this from a good distance now. Some years on, the ranch settled into itself. The cattle and the land and the house all bearing the mark of being properly cared for by 2 people who understood what they were doing and why it mattered. I kept the letter, I have it still. The first one, the one with the terms, capable woman, hard work, no illusions. Prewitt's original response is in the desk, and Nora's 1-page letter to me, the precise handwriting, the reasonable, practical terms. I read them sometimes, not out of any sentiment about how we began, but because I think it is worth remembering that the truest things sometimes arrive in plain packaging. That a man can set out looking for order and find instead that he was looking for meaning, and not know the difference until the winter teaches him. She found me the way the right thing always finds a stubborn man. Quietly, through the door he left open by accident while he was busy keeping the others shut. I had called it a bargain. She was patient enough to let me learn what it actually was. I did learn it, and I have been grateful every morning since, for the coffee she makes and leaves for me when she's up first, for the way she reads in the parlor with the south wall light on her, for the specific sound of her voice when she is talking to the calico cat with the dignified seriousness she gives to things she has quietly decided are worth her attention. For the jar on the kitchen table, which has never once been empty since October of 1881. That is what I set out to arrange. That is what I got. I am the one who got the better half.